This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of life that does not look tragic from the outside, and that is exactly why it can take so long to admit that something inside it is dying. I know that sounds dramatic. Maybe even a little dangerous. But that is how it began for me, not with a disaster, not with a scandal, not with a moment anyone else would have called a crisis. It began with something far more unsettling, the slow, unbearable realization that I was still showing up for my life, but I was no longer inside it. I was there, technically. I answered messages. I handled responsibilities. I remembered what needed to be remembered. I paid the bills, made the appointments, kept the wheels turning, said the right things, wore the calm face, and did what women like me often do so well. I remained functional. And because I remained functional, no one knew that something had gone terribly quiet in me. That is the part no one warns us about. Sometimes a woman does not fall apart. Sometimes she simply fades in place. Not publicly. Not obviously. Not in a way that alarms the people around her. She just becomes a little less alive in her own eyes. A little more efficient. A little less curious. A little less willing to ask herself hard questions because she is afraid of what the answers might cost. She starts living by maintenance instead of meaning. She becomes excellent at continuing. And one day, she wakes up and realizes she has become a woman who can carry almost anything except the truth. The truth was this: the life I had built no longer fit the woman I had become. It took me a long time to say that without guilt. For a while, I kept trying to rename the feeling. I called it stress. I called it a phase. I called it exhaustion. I called it hormones. I called it being busy. I called it adulthood. I called it what strong women call their pain when they are not yet ready to face it directly. But deep down, I knew better. I knew the problem was not that I had too much to do. It was that I had spent too long becoming the version of myself that could survive anything, and somewhere in the process, I stopped asking whether survival was still enough for me. That kind of realization is not glamorous. It does not arrive with clarity and perfect lighting. It arrives in strange, private moments. In the car after a perfectly normal day, when I am suddenly not ready to go inside. In the kitchen, staring at nothing, feeling a heaviness I cannot explain. In the middle of a conversation where I hear myself speaking and think, when did my voice become this flat? In the bathroom mirror, when I catch my own face and there is nothing visibly wrong, but I can feel a distance between me and the woman looking back. That distance can become a whole life if I let it. And I think many women do let it, not because they are weak, but because they are trained to distrust any longing that cannot be justified by catastrophe. If nothing is broken enough, if no one has left, if the house is still standing, if the marriage is still technically intact, if the job still pays, if the children still need things, if everyone still describes me as dependable, then what right do I have to say that something is wrong? But I am learning this. Pain does not have to become dramatic before it becomes valid. Sometimes the deepest unhappiness wears a very respectable outfit. Sometimes it looks like a woman who is admired for how well she holds everything together. Sometimes it looks like me. Before I go any further, if this kind of conversation speaks to something private in you, subscribe to the channel. That support matters more than you know, and it helps me keep making the kind of videos that tell the truth about what women carry silently. What shook me most was not that I felt unhappy. It was that I had become so skilled at ignoring myself that I almost mistook numbness for peace. There is a difference. Peace has life in it. Peace has breath in it. Peace does not make me disappear. Peace does not flatten my inner world until every day tastes the same. Numbness does that. Numbness is quieter than pain, which is why it is so easy to decorate. I can put routines around it. I can put productivity around it. I can put nice candles, clean countertops, decent skin, a manageable schedule, and a polite smile around it. I can make numbness look like stability. But my body knows the difference before my mind is ready to admit it. My body knew in the fatigue that rest did not fix. In the irritation that had no clear cause. In the way ordinary things began to feel heavier than they should have. In the way joy stopped arriving naturally and had to be manufactured. In the way I kept telling myself I just needed a break, when what I really needed was a reckoning. Because a break was not going to solve what was happening. A vacation was not going to solve it. A weekend off was not going to solve it. Buying something new was not going to solve it. Getting more organized was not going to solve it. The issue was not that I needed to escape my life for a few days. The issue was that I had quietly built a life I could manage, but could no longer deeply inhabit. That is a frightening thing to admit when I have spent years being praised for exactly that life. Praised for being steady. Praised for being low maintenance. Praised for being mature. Praised for being the one who could handle it. Praised for not making a mess. Praised for being fine. But fine is a dangerous word when it becomes the ceiling of a woman's life. Fine can hide loneliness. Fine can hide resentment. Fine can hide grief. Fine can hide emotional starvation. Fine can hide the ache of being surrounded by people who know what I do, but not what I feel. Fine can hide a woman who has become so accustomed to being needed that she no longer knows what it means to be nourished. I think that is why this moment matters so much. The quiet moment. The invisible turning point. The instant I stop asking myself, what is wrong with me? And start asking a far more honest question, what no longer fits me? That question changes the atmosphere immediately. Because now I am not a problem to solve. I am a woman to understand. And when I began to understand myself, I saw things I had spent years avoiding. I saw how routine had become a hiding place. I saw how often I had confused responsibility with aliveness. I saw the private grief of outgrowing a life before I had language for what came next. I saw how many parts of my identity were built around being acceptable, useful, unshakable, and easy to rely on. I saw how little room those identities left for softness, uncertainty, reinvention, slowness, and truth. I also saw something else, something harder to admit. Part of me had been waiting for a collapse because I did not know I was allowed to change before things became unbearable. I thought maybe I had to earn a new life through suffering. I thought maybe I had to hit the wall first. I thought maybe I needed a crisis big enough to make everyone understand. But maybe the quiet knowing is enough. Maybe the private ache is enough. Maybe the loneliness I feel in the middle of my own well-managed life is enough. Maybe I do not need permission in the form of destruction. Maybe honesty is enough. That is where this began for me. Not with a grand plan. Not with instant confidence. Not with some glamorous before and after fantasy. It began with a woman standing inside a life that looked reasonable and feeling, in a very quiet and terrifying way, that she could not keep betraying herself by calling it enough. And if I am honest, that was the first real moment of my reinvention. Not the day I changed something on the outside. Not the day I made a list. Not the day I bought a journal or cleaned out a closet or promised myself a new era. It was the day I stopped arguing with the truth. The truth that I was not broken. The truth that I was not ungrateful. The truth that I was not dramatic. The truth that I was simply no longer meant to remain the woman who had learned how to live with too little emotional life in her own life. That is a sacred moment, even when it feels frightening. Because the moment I admit that my life no longer fits me, I stop trying to shrink myself to fit it. And once that happens, nothing stays the same. I stopped trying to fix myself and started studying myself. For a long time, I believed my problem was that I needed to be corrected. That is such a brutal way to live, even when it sounds disciplined from the outside. I kept approaching myself like a project that had gone off track. Every few weeks, sometimes every few days, I would identify a new flaw and decide that was the thing ruining my life. My body. My schedule. My lack of consistency. My emotions. My spending. My procrastination. My confidence. My habits. I kept pulling one thread at a time, convinced that if I could just fix the obvious weakness, everything else would finally settle into place. It never did. Because I was not actually understanding myself. I was auditing myself like an enemy. There is a difference between self-awareness and self-surveillance, and I think many women live inside that confusion for years. We call it discipline. We call it accountability. We call it being honest with ourselves. But often, what we are really doing is standing over our own lives with a clipboard, documenting everything that disappoints us, without ever asking a deeper question. What is this pattern trying to tell me? That question changed the way I saw myself. I stopped asking, what is wrong with me? And I started asking, what is happening with me? That shift sounds small. It was not small. Because the first question comes with accusation built into it. It assumes defect. It assumes there is something fundamentally flawed at the center of me, and that my job is to locate it, shame it, and replace it with a better trait. The second question is different. It carries curiosity. It leaves room for context. It allows me to notice my life as a whole system instead of a pile of personal failures. And once I started looking at my life that way, I saw things I had never really allowed myself to see. I saw that many of the things I called flaws were actually patterns. And patterns always have roots. What I called inconsistency was often exhaustion. What I called laziness was often resistance built on resentment. What I called oversensitivity was sometimes sharp intuition I had trained myself to dismiss. What I called procrastination was often fear in a polished outfit. What I called lack of discipline was sometimes a life designed in a way that kept draining me before I ever had a chance to show up well. I needed to study that, not judge it. So I began to pay attention in a way that felt almost new to me. Not as the woman trying to win a case against herself, but as the woman trying to understand the architecture of her own life. I looked at where my energy went before I looked at where my dreams went. That mattered, because a woman can say she wants a different life, but if her attention is being bled out in 100 tiny directions every day, her future never really stands a chance. I started noticing what I gave my best hours to. What kind of conversations left me foggy? Which environments made me contract? Which tasks I delayed over and over again? What I reached for when I did not want to feel discomfort? What time of day I was most honest with myself? What kind of people made me betray my own instincts? What parts of my life looked manageable on paper but felt dead in practice? I also stopped speaking in vague language. I stopped saying I was off or stuck or not myself without forcing myself to get more precise. Precision is uncomfortable, but it is merciful. It gets me out of drama and into truth. So instead of saying, I feel off, I asked, when exactly do I feel most disconnected from myself? What usually happens right before that feeling appears? What am I tolerating? What am I swallowing? What am I postponing? What am I pretending not to know? That kind of self-study does not flatter me. It reveals me. And I needed that. I needed to see that some of my suffering had become so familiar that I was calling it personality. I needed to see that there were habits I defended simply because they were woven into the identity I knew how to perform. I needed to see how much of my life had been arranged around keeping things running smoothly rather than keeping myself fully alive. One of the most revealing things I did was a kind of life inventory. Not in a dramatic, start over from scratch way. In a quiet, almost forensic way. I looked at my bedroom and asked what kind of woman this room belonged to. A rested one? A peaceful one? A woman who makes space for herself? Or a woman who collapses in here at the end of the day with just enough energy to survive tomorrow? I looked at my closet and asked what I kept wearing when I wanted to hide. What I kept saving for some future version of myself. What I had outgrown but still kept because it reminded me of who I used to be, or who I thought I was supposed to stay. I looked at my calendar and asked who it was built to serve. My values. My health. My priorities. Or everyone else's access to me. I looked at my phone and saw the truest confession of all. What I touched first. What I touched when I was lonely. What I touched when I was avoiding a decision. What I touched when I wanted comfort without honesty. I looked at my bank statement and learned things I had not wanted to learn. Money leaves a trail of emotional truth. It shows me what I soothe with spending, what I postpone out of fear, what I value in theory and what I value in practice. It shows me whether I am investing in the life I say I want, or just coping more beautifully inside the one I have. None of this was glamorous. But it was clarifying. I also started listening to my repeated complaints, because repeated complaints are rarely random. They are often grief in a practical voice. If I kept saying I had no time, maybe the issue was not time. Maybe the issue was that I was still living as if my own needs were infinitely flexible. If I kept saying I felt invisible, maybe I needed to look at where I had made myself too emotionally convenient. If I kept saying I was tired all the time, maybe I needed to tell the truth about what kind of life I was asking my body to carry. If I kept saying I did not know what I wanted, maybe I needed to admit that I had been trained to know what everyone else wanted from me first. That realization hurt. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was intimate. It is one thing to discover that life has disappointed me. It is another to discover the quiet places where I have participated in my own diminishment. I do not say that to be harsh. I say it because it is powerful to finally see where I keep abandoning myself in small, socially acceptable ways. Saying yes too quickly. Downplaying what I know. Explaining myself past the point of dignity. Letting guilt make decisions that clarity should make. Spending for relief instead of choosing for alignment. Keeping myself overstimulated because silence might tell me the truth. Calling my instincts too much when they were often the only honest thing in the room. When I began to study myself, I also began to notice what stirred envy in me. That was revealing in a way I did not expect. Envy can be ugly when it turns into resentment, but before it becomes that, it is often just information. It points toward some neglected hunger. I would see another woman and feel something tighten in me, and instead of judging myself for it, I started asking, what exactly am I reacting to? Was it her beauty? Sometimes, yes, but often not in the shallow way people assume. Often I was reacting to what her beauty represented: self-regard, rest, steadiness, the right to take up space without apology. Was it her success? Sometimes. But more often it was her clarity, her clean decisions, her relationship with her own life. The feeling that she lived from inside herself instead of always from demand. That helped me stop pretending I was confused when I was actually afraid of admitting what I wanted. And then there was this harder truth. Some parts of me did not want to be studied because they knew they would have to change once I truly saw them. Avoidance survives in vagueness. So does self-betrayal. So does passivity. So does emotional drift. But once I named what was happening, I could not unknow it. I could no longer call it a bad week when it was a repeated pattern. I could no longer call it stress when it was misalignment. I could no longer call it overthinking when it was self-abandonment with a polished vocabulary. That is what this stage of reinvention gave me. Not instant transformation. Not a new personality. Not the thrill of a dramatic breakthrough. It gave me accuracy. And accuracy is underrated, especially in a world that constantly encourages women to either beautify their pain or weaponize it against themselves. I did not need either of those things. I needed to become honest enough to observe my life without rushing to defend it. Because once I saw myself clearly, I stopped feeling like a mystery to myself. I began to understand why certain patterns kept repeating. Why certain rooms exhausted me. Why certain people confused me. Why certain habits always returned when I felt emotionally thin. Why some versions of my life looked fine from the outside and still felt wrong from within. And from that place, something very important became possible. Compassion with standards. Not indulgence. Not shame. Something much more useful than both. I could say, I see what you are doing. I see why you learned it. And I can also see that it is no longer the life you want. That is a different kind of beginning. Not fixing. Not forcing. Not performing growth. Just the slow, sobering relief of finally telling the truth about the woman I had become, and the patterns that were keeping her from herself. I had to get honest about the woman I wanted to become. After I stopped looking at myself as a problem to be corrected, another question rose up almost immediately, and it was harder than I expected. If I am no longer trying to return to who I used to be, then who, exactly, am I becoming? That question sounds simple until I actually sit with it. For a long time, I had been far more fluent in what I did not want than in what I truly desired. I knew what was tiring me. I knew what no longer fit. I knew what kinds of conversations left me empty, what routines drained me, what emotional roles I was no longer willing to keep performing. But there is a difference between walking away from what is wrong and walking toward what is true. One is about relief. The other is about vision. And vision asks more of me than dissatisfaction ever did. It asked me to tell the truth about the woman I wanted to become. Not the woman who would impress people. Not the woman who would photograph well. Not the woman who would finally make everyone understand me. Not the woman built out of trends, fantasies, or reaction. The real woman. The one I could live inside. That honesty was difficult because many women, especially by the time they have spent years taking care of responsibilities, become deeply practiced at adaptation. We know how to respond. We know how to accommodate. We know how to survive different seasons of life by becoming what the season requires. But somewhere along the way, that skill can cost us something intimate. I can become so responsive to what life needs from me that I lose contact with what I deeply want for myself. So when I first asked who I wanted to become, I did not get some immediate, sparkling answer. I got silence. Not because there was nothing there, but because I had not been listening in that direction for a very long time. I had spent years making decisions based on urgency, practicality, timing, loyalty, duty, relationships, survival, and what made the most sense on paper. Desire had become secondary. Beauty had become optional. Peace had become something I admired in other women instead of something I treated as part of my own design. I had not asked myself enough questions that had no audience attached to them. What kind of life feels like mine? What kind of home softens me? What pace lets me think clearly? What standards make me feel protected rather than restricted? What does my femininity look like when it is not being performed, but inhabited? How do I want to speak? How do I want to be loved? How do I want to spend a Tuesday afternoon, not a fantasy vacation, but a real Tuesday? Those questions changed everything because they forced me out of vague language. I could no longer hide behind broad statements like I want peace, I want confidence, I want a better life. Those phrases can mean almost anything, and because they can mean almost anything, they often change nothing. I needed detail. I needed to know what peace looked like in the actual architecture of my days. Did it mean waking up earlier, before other people's needs rushed in? Did it mean a quieter phone? Fewer obligations? More money saved? More time outside? A cleaner kitchen? More elegant boundaries? Better sleep? More solitude? Better conversations? Less explaining? A home that felt less like a waiting room and more like a sanctuary? The answer, I realized, was yes. Peace was not abstract. It had 1,000 small physical forms. The same was true of confidence. For years, I had thought of confidence as a feeling that might arrive one day if I finally looked right, chose right, healed enough, earned enough, or stopped doubting myself so much. But when I really thought about the woman I wanted to become, confidence looked much less theatrical than I had imagined. It looked like self-possession. It looked like moving slowly enough not to abandon my own thoughts. It looked like not over-explaining. It looked like making decisions without building a courtroom around them. It looked like not needing to be loudly seen because I was no longer invisible to myself. That was the beginning of my future self becoming real to me. Not as a perfect woman. Not as a superior woman. But as a specific woman. I began writing her down, and what struck me first was that I did not want a bigger life nearly as much as I wanted a true one. I wanted a woman who woke up and did not immediately feel behind. A woman whose mornings belonged to her before the world started asking. A woman who knew what she liked. A woman who could walk into a room without mentally rearranging herself to be easier to receive. A woman who had edited her life enough that she could finally hear herself think. I wanted a woman who was warm but not endlessly available. A woman who was gracious but not porous. A woman who was kind without being self-erasing. A woman who no longer confused exhaustion with virtue. I wanted a woman whose external life reflected an internal decision. I am no longer living as if my needs are the least important needs in the room. Once I started getting honest, I also had to admit that I did not only want emotional change. I wanted texture, shape, atmosphere. I wanted my life to feel different in the senses, not just in theory. I wanted to wake up in a bedroom that felt breathable. I wanted my clothes to make me feel composed instead of accidental. I wanted my home to look like someone thoughtful lived there. I wanted my evenings to stop disappearing into digital fog. I wanted my body to feel supported, not dragged. I wanted my weekends to contain something beautiful, even if it was small. I wanted to become the kind of woman who buys flowers without waiting for a reason. who reads books that deepen her, who cooks one meal well instead of living in constant improvisation, who treats her energy like something worth protecting. There was also a relational truth I could not avoid. The woman I wanted to become had standards that were no longer negotiable. She did not keep people close simply because they had known her a long time. She did not call something love if it required her to stay confused. She did not tolerate chronic inconsistency just because it came wrapped in charm, history, or familiarity. She did not continue conversations that left her feeling smaller. She did not perform emotional labor for people who treated her care like a utility. That part mattered more than I first realized, because when I imagined the life I wanted, it was not just about how I felt alone. It was about what kind of treatment could remain in my life and still match the woman I was becoming. Some things could not come with me. Then there was the question of work, purpose, and ambition, which becomes especially complicated for women who have already lived enough life to know that achievement alone does not save anyone. I did not want a vision built only around success. I wanted one built around congruence. I wanted work that respected my nervous system. I wanted money that created dignity, not just image. I wanted ambition that did not require me to fracture myself into pieces just to keep up. I wanted to feel proud of how I lived, not just what I produced. That is a different kind of aspiration. Quieter, perhaps, but deeper. The more honest I became, the more I realized that the woman I wanted to become was not someone far away. She was not a stranger. She was not some fantasy self built out of denial. In many ways, she was made of things that had always been true about me, but had been buried under fatigue, compromise, overstimulation, fear, and years of adaptation. She liked beauty. She needed spaciousness. She valued depth. She did not thrive in noise. She wanted intimacy, but not intrusion. She wanted elegance, but not performance. She wanted discipline, but not punishment. She wanted to be fully awake inside her own life. What I was really doing was not inventing her. I was remembering her. And that made the process more emotional than I expected, because remembering myself required grieving the years I had spent living at a distance from what I knew all along. It required acknowledging how often I had talked myself out of my own longings because they seemed impractical, indulgent, or too difficult to explain to other people. It required facing the fact that clarity can be painful because once I know what I want, I can no longer pretend that my current life is neutral. That is the cost of honesty. It removes my favorite hiding places. But it also gives me something I had not had in a long time: direction. Not borrowed direction. Not socially approved direction. My direction. And once I had that, decisions began to change shape. I no longer had to ask only what was efficient, polite, expected, or familiar. I could ask a better question: does this belong in the life of the woman I am becoming? That question became a kind of private compass. Sometimes it led to beautiful choices. Sometimes it led to uncomfortable ones. Sometimes it asked me to upgrade. Sometimes it asked me to let go. Sometimes it asked me to wait. Sometimes it asked me to stop pretending I was confused. But every time I used it, I felt myself moving closer to a life that had a center again. That is what honesty about my future self gave me. Not perfection. Not reinvention as spectacle. Not some polished persona I had to perform. It gave me a woman I could recognize. A life I could feel. A standard I could live toward. And for the first time in a long time, wanting more from my life no longer felt vague. It felt intimate. It felt grounded. It felt irreversible. Because once I finally told the truth about the woman I wanted to become, I could no longer keep living as if I had never met her. I changed my environment before I tried to change my entire personality. What surprised me most was how little of my struggle was happening in isolation. For a long time, I thought change was supposed to be a private act of will. I thought if I wanted to become calmer, clearer, more disciplined, more alive, I needed to transform something deep inside myself first. I believed my environment was just background. The house was the house. The phone was the phone. The schedule was the schedule. The people around me were simply my life, and my job was to somehow become stronger than the effect they had on me. But that was not true. My environment was never neutral. It was teaching me something every day. It was shaping my mood, my pace, my standards, my nervous system, my attention, and even the story I kept telling myself about who I was. And once I understood that, I stopped asking myself to become a new woman inside a setting that kept training me to remain the old one. That realization was humbling, because it meant I had to stop blaming my entire life on a lack of discipline. It meant I had to look at the conditions I was living in with more honesty. It meant I had to admit that I had created, allowed, or inherited an atmosphere that made it difficult to hear myself, difficult to rest, difficult to choose well, difficult to stay connected to the woman I was trying to become. I started with my home, because home is where so many women quietly disappear. Not in some dramatic way. In a gradual way. Through piles and noise and unfinished decisions and surfaces that become storage for mental overload. Through rooms that still function, but do not nourish. Through spaces that are technically clean enough, but emotionally crowded. Through the slow normalization of living somewhere that asks nothing of my soul except efficiency. I had to ask myself a very uncomfortable question. What does my home feel like to my body? Not what does it look like to a guest. Not is it presentable. Not is it good enough. What does it feel like to me, the woman who wakes up there, moves through it, exhales there, ages there, cries there, lies awake there, starts and ends her days there? The answer mattered more than I expected. Because I realized that I had been living in spaces that reflected maintenance more than intimacy. Rooms that held my obligations more clearly than they held my presence. There were corners of my home that looked like evidence of a woman who was constantly catching up, constantly setting things down for later, constantly living one step behind herself. That kind of environment does something subtle but powerful. It keeps reinforcing the feeling that life is happening to me faster than I can meet it. So I stopped thinking of my home as a place I simply needed to keep under control, and I began thinking of it as an emotional instrument. What it held, what it reflected, what it invited, what it interrupted, what it softened, what it overstimulated, none of that was trivial. I changed small things first. The kind of things that would seem almost unimportant to someone who does not understand what atmosphere does to a woman. I cleared surfaces. Not because I was trying to become perfect, but because visual noise has a way of becoming emotional noise. I changed harsh lighting. I opened windows more often. I stopped letting every room become a holding area for postponed decisions. I put things away with more finality. I stopped saving beauty for guests. I placed objects where they created calm instead of clutter. I gave myself a chair that was not for work, not for folding laundry, not for anything except sitting down like my own company mattered. The changes were quiet, but I felt them immediately. A softer room changes the tone of a woman's thoughts. A cleaner counter changes how she enters the morning. A made bed changes how she returns to herself at night. A small lamp instead of a bright ceiling light can change the emotional quality of an evening in ways that sound foolish until I live them. I think women are often encouraged to treat beauty as decorative and function as serious. But I no longer believe that. Beauty, at least in the life I wanted, was not excess. It was regulation. It was permission. It was evidence that I was no longer building a life around constant endurance. Then I looked at my digital environment, which may have been even more intrusive than the physical one. I do not think most women realize how much of their emotional life is being shaped by what they absorb before breakfast. I had gotten used to beginning my day with other people's urgency, other people's opinions, other people's lives, other people's beauty, other people's news, other people's language. I was letting a device set the emotional weather of my inner world before I had even heard one honest thought of my own. That had to change. I began editing my digital life with the same seriousness I wanted to bring to my home. I removed what made me feel fragmented. I unfollowed people whose content made me feel subtly worse about myself, even when I could not fully explain why. I muted noise. I stopped granting constant access to things that made me compare, consume, react, or drift. I turned off what did not deserve instant access to my attention. I became more suspicious of anything that made me feel rushed, behind, ugly, inadequate, or emotionally scattered after only a few minutes. There is an intimacy to what I allow into my mind repeatedly. I had to start treating that intimacy with respect. Because if I spend hours absorbing images of speed, pressure, perfection, conflict, consumption, and endless commentary, then of course I will struggle to feel anchored in myself. Of course I will have trouble hearing my own preferences. Of course my desires will become harder to distinguish from my conditioning. I also had to look at my schedule, which told the truth about me in a way my intentions did not. My calendar had become a place where availability masqueraded as virtue. There was too much packed into it, and not all of it was necessary. Some of it was habit. Some of it was avoidance. Some of it was old programming that told me a full life had to look crowded in order to count. But I had reached a point where fullness without spaciousness no longer felt rich. It felt invasive. I started noticing how quickly I gave away the edges of my day. How often I left no room between obligations. How rarely I allowed for transition, reflection, beauty, stillness, or recovery. I was living as if my energy would regenerate on command, as if my body and mind did not need gentler handoffs from one part of the day to another. That kind of schedule does not just make a woman tired. It keeps her inaccessible to herself. So I began protecting margins. A little more space in the morning. A little less rushing in the evening. Fewer automatic yeses. More honest pauses before agreeing. More white space left intentionally open, not because I had nothing to do, but because I was no longer willing to be booked so tightly that I disappeared from my own life. Then there were people. This part was harder, because changing a room does not look back at me. People do. I had to become honest about who felt nourishing and who felt draining, and I had to do that without turning it into a dramatic moral judgment. Not every difficult relationship is abusive. Not every draining person is malicious. But some dynamics pull me away from myself so consistently that staying deeply available to them becomes a form of self-neglect. I began paying attention to how my body felt after time with certain people. Not what I told myself about them. Not what history said I owed them. Not what politeness demanded. What did I actually feel? More expanded, or more tight? More honest, or more edited? More grounded, or more scrambled? more like myself, or more like a role. That told me more than any analysis ever could. Some relationships had been built around a version of me that no longer existed. A more reachable me. A more agreeable me. A more endlessly flexible me. A more emotionally available me. And once I started changing, I could feel the tension of those old structures pushing back. That is the uncomfortable truth about environment. Sometimes it is not just walls and objects and schedules. Sometimes it is expectations. Sometimes it is the people who feel entitled to the shape I used to hold. I had to learn that not everything familiar is safe, and not everything uncomfortable is wrong. Sometimes the discomfort is simply the feeling of no longer fitting inside old access patterns. What I wanted was not an impressive environment. I wanted a coherent one. A life where my surroundings no longer contradicted my deepest needs. A life where my home calmed me instead of reminding me of what I had not done. A life where my phone served me instead of managing me. A life where my calendar reflected my values instead of my guilt. A life where my company was chosen with more care. A life with atmosphere, softness, order, and enough silence for something real to rise in me again. I think this is one of the most overlooked parts of reinvention. We talk so much about changing mindset, but less about changing the setting in which that mindset has to survive. But I could not keep asking myself for clarity in rooms full of noise. I could not ask for softness in an atmosphere built around urgency. I could not ask for peace while surrounding myself with constant stimulation, constant access, constant unfinishedness. So I stopped trying to change my entire personality first. I changed what kept introducing me to the version of myself I was trying to outgrow. And that, more than I expected, is when life began to feel different. Not because everything was solved, but because my surroundings were no longer quietly arguing with my becoming. I rebuilt my body relationship without turning my life into punishment. There was a time when I thought the only way to change my body was to become harder toward it. Harder in my thoughts. Harder in my routines. Harder in the way I looked at myself in the mirror. Harder in the language I used after a heavy meal, a tired week, a season of stress, a photograph I did not like, a morning when my face looked older than I felt ready for. I thought discipline had to come with some edge of disgust, as if tenderness would make me lazy and self-acceptance would make me careless. I understand now how much damage that belief can do. Because when a woman has spent enough years living under pressure, the body often becomes the easiest place to put all the disappointment. It is visible. It is measurable. It seems manageable in a way grief is not, loneliness is not, burnout is not, emotional depletion is not. So I can point to my body and tell myself that if I could just fix this part, lose the weight, tone the arms, flatten the stomach, smooth the skin, improve the posture, undo the fatigue showing on my face, then I would finally feel like myself again. But that was never the whole truth. My body was not the origin of my disconnection. It was the place where disconnection had gone to live. That changed the way I had to approach it. I could no longer treat my body like a problem that had interrupted my life. I had to start seeing it as the place where my life had been speaking to me all along. Through exhaustion that sleep alone did not fix. Through tension I carried in my shoulders and jaw. Through the afternoon crashes I kept blaming on lack of discipline. Through cravings that were not only about food, but about comfort, steadiness, and emotional relief. Through the strange heaviness of moving through the day feeling both overstimulated and undernourished. My body had not betrayed me. It had been absorbing me. Absorbing my pace, my stress, my grief, my neglect, my coping, my overstimulation, my years of pushing through. And because I had been trained, like so many women, to keep going unless something became unbearable, I had missed the quieter messages. The small daily signs that I was no longer living in a way that honored the fact that I had a body at all, not just a schedule wrapped around one. So rebuilding my relationship with my body did not begin with a goal weight. It did not begin with a dramatic workout plan or an extreme reinvention fantasy. It began with a more sobering question: what would it mean to stop living in opposition to myself? That question moved me away from punishment and toward partnership. For the first time in a long time, I stopped asking only how my body looked and began asking how my body was living. Was it rested? Was it inflamed? Was it rushed? Was it nourished? Was it being worked with or simply managed? Was I making choices that helped it feel safe, steady, and supported, or was I only paying attention when I wanted it to become more acceptable to me? There is something profoundly sad about how many women know how to monitor their bodies but do not know how to care for them. We know how to criticize. We know how to compare. We know how to start over on Mondays. We know how to make rules and break rules and feel guilty and restart the entire emotional cycle. But real care is different. It is quieter, less dramatic, less visible. It often looks unimpressive from the outside. It looks like consistency. It looks like enough sleep. It looks like eating before I become irritable and shaky. It looks like stretching when I would rather ignore the stiffness. It looks like drinking water before another cup of coffee. It looks like learning that energy is not a personality trait but a condition shaped by 100 daily decisions. That kind of care required me to let go of the fantasy that transformation had to hurt in order to count. I did not want to turn my life into a correctional facility. I did not want every meal to feel morally loaded or every workout to feel like payment for having taken up space. I no longer wanted to relate to my own reflection like a disappointed supervisor. That relationship had never made me feel more alive. It had only made me more divided. So I began with energy. Not because appearance stopped mattering, but because I was old enough to know that when a woman's energy changes, everything changes with it. Her patience, her decisions, her cravings, her confidence, her posture, her face, her boundaries, her ability to keep promises to herself. A depleted woman can look polished for a while, but depletion always collects interest somewhere. I started paying attention to things that sounded ordinary and ended up feeling profound. Morning light, walking, protein, hydration, less caffeine on an empty stomach, more regular meals, a little strength training, better sleep hygiene, a slower evening. Fewer nights spent dragging myself past the point where my body had already asked for mercy. None of these things were glamorous. That may be why they are often overlooked. But they restored something I had been missing for longer than I realized: steadiness. And steadiness is deeply emotional. When my blood sugar is more stable, I am less reactive. When I sleep better, I am less fragile. When I move regularly, I am more present. When I eat like I matter, I stop living in the mood swings of neglect. When I strengthen my body, I stop feeling as though life happens to me from above and around me. I feel rooted in it again. That word matters to me now, rooted. I did not want to feel constantly at war with my own physical existence. I wanted to feel rooted in it. I wanted to inhabit myself with more dignity. That also changed the way I thought about movement. I stopped asking what kind of exercise would change me fastest and started asking what kind of movement would make me feel more at home in my own life. Some seasons that meant long walks because walking gave me a way to return to myself without performance. Some seasons it meant strength training because there is something emotionally powerful about feeling my body become more capable instead of merely smaller. Some seasons it meant Pilates or mobility work because I wanted elegance, not just exertion. I no longer wanted to move from shame. I wanted to move from respect. Respect is a different atmosphere. Respect does not scream. Respect does not humiliate. Respect does not disappear when I gain a few pounds, feel bloated, look tired, or age in ways I cannot negotiate with. Respect says, this body is carrying me through a real life, and I want to stop making that harder than it already is. Food changed for me in a similar way. I stopped wanting food to solve emotional problems it was never designed to solve. That did not happen perfectly or overnight. But I began noticing the emotional posture beneath the way I ate. Was I feeding myself from care or from depletion? Was I choosing based on how I wanted to feel later, or only how quickly I wanted relief now? Was I planning nourishment, or just reaching for whatever my exhaustion would agree to? I had to be honest about how often I had treated food as both reward and anesthesia. Not because I was weak, but because I was tired, overstimulated, and emotionally underfed in other parts of my life. Once I saw that, I could stop moralizing my habits and start understanding them. And understanding made change more possible than shame ever did. My relationship with appearance also had to mature. I did not want to pretend that beauty no longer mattered to me. That would have been dishonest. I care about beauty. I care about how I carry myself. I care about clothing, skincare, hair, posture, softness, presence. But I wanted to free those things from the old emotional charge of desperation. I did not want to beautify myself in order to become worthy of being seen. I wanted my appearance to become an extension of self-regard. That is a subtle but life-changing difference. When I began dressing from self-respect instead of insecurity, I chose differently. I stopped buying clothes for the life I wished would validate me and started choosing clothes for the woman I wanted to feel like inside my actual days. I wanted structure, elegance, ease, and a sense of coherence. I wanted to look pulled together without looking as if I was pleading to be admired. I wanted my style to say, quietly, that I knew myself. The same with beauty rituals. I stopped chasing endless products that promised reinvention and started creating rituals that communicated care. Washing my face slowly at night. Moisturizing not only my face but my hands, my neck, the parts of me that so often carry the signs of neglect first. Brushing my hair before bed. Taking supplements consistently. Paying attention to posture. Sitting differently. Breathing more deeply. Wearing things that did not irritate me. Choosing shoes I could actually live in. These are small acts, but small acts repeated become identity. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped speaking about my body as if it were a separate creature making my life inconvenient. No more I hate my body. No more I need to get rid of this. No more I have let myself go. That language is not neutral. The body hears it. The mind builds around it. And over time, a woman can become estranged from herself without even realizing how often she is reinforcing the split. I wanted to close that distance. Not because I suddenly loved every single thing I saw. That is not the point. The point was not perfection. The point was intimacy, familiarity, reverence, even. The point was to stop abandoning myself in the one place I can never truly leave. Because the truth is, midlife asks a different kind of beauty from a woman. Not the beauty of trying to remain untouched by time, but the beauty of becoming more deeply inhabited, more rested, more honest, more deliberate, more tender with what has carried her. There is a dignity in that which no trend can offer. So rebuilding my body relationship was never just about health. It was about belonging to myself again. It was about making sure that when I walked through my own life, I was not dragging my body behind me like a burden, nor interrogating it like an enemy, nor decorating it like a performance. I was living inside it with more care, more precision, more gratitude, and more respect. That is what changed everything. Not punishment. Not pressure. Not another round of self-rejection disguised as discipline. Just the slow return to a body that had been waiting, patiently, for me to treat it like home. I had to let my mind become a place I could safely live in. There came a point when I realized that changing my life on the outside would never be enough if my mind still felt like a place I had to survive. That was a difficult truth to face, because for a long time I had been living as if my mind was simply something I had to manage. I treated it like weather. Some days it was heavy, some days sharp, some days restless, some days cruel, and my only job was to endure it without letting too much of it show. I thought that was maturity. I thought being an adult meant learning how to function while carrying an inner world that was constantly braced, constantly noisy, constantly preparing for disappointment. But there is a difference between functioning and feeling safe inside my own thoughts. And if I am honest, I had not felt truly safe in my mind for a very long time. I do not mean that in a dramatic way. I mean something quieter, and in some ways more exhausting. My mind had become a place of constant commentary. A place where every mistake was archived, every delay became evidence, every emotional reaction needed to be analyzed, every desire had to be justified, every hope had to pass through suspicion before it was allowed to feel real. I was not simply thinking. I was monitoring, correcting, rehearsing, predicting, revisiting, second-guessing, and defending. Even in silence, there was very little rest. That kind of mental life changes a woman. It makes her tired in places sleep cannot reach. It makes ordinary decisions feel heavier than they are. It makes joy feel unstable because some part of her is always waiting for interruption. It makes self-trust almost impossible, because every instinct has to survive cross-examination before it is allowed to guide her anywhere. I think many women live this way and call it being responsible. We call it staying on top of things. We call it being realistic. We call it thinking things through. We call it emotional intelligence. But often, what it really is fear with good manners. Fear that if I stop anticipating, I will be blindsided. Fear that if I stop criticizing myself, I will let everything slide. Fear that if I stop controlling the narrative in my own head, life will become too unpredictable to bear. So I stayed mentally vigilant for years, and it cost me more than I understood at the time. Because the mind cannot become a place of renewal if it is always operating like a command center. It cannot offer me wisdom if it is flooded with surveillance. It cannot offer me peace if every thought is forced to prove its innocence before it can exist. I had to change that. Not by becoming artificially positive. Not by pretending pain could be reframed into something beautiful every single time. Not by forcing optimism into places that needed honesty. I was never interested in decorating my mind with pretty language while the deeper structure stayed the same. I wanted something more real than that. I wanted an inner life that did not immediately turn against me the moment I fell short, changed my mind, felt grief, or needed more than I thought I should. The first thing I had to confront was the private language I had normalized. It is astonishing what a woman can get used to hearing from herself. I had thoughts that sounded so familiar I stopped noticing how violent they were. I would tell myself I was behind, weak, inconsistent, difficult, too emotional, bad with money, bad with habits, bad at follow-through, always almost getting there but never quite arriving. None of these thoughts were loud enough to sound theatrical. That is what made them dangerous. They were efficient, polished, repetitive. They moved through my mind like office memos, as if they were simply part of how an adult woman speaks to herself. But repetition gives thoughts authority they have not earned. And once I started listening more carefully, I realized many of the sentences shaping my life were not true. They were old. They were inherited. They were protective in the wrong way. They kept me emotionally loyal to a version of myself I no longer wanted to live inside. I began writing these thoughts down, not to obsess over them, but to finally see them. On paper, they looked different. Colder. Smaller. Less wise than they had sounded in my head. I could ask a better question then. If I keep speaking to myself this way for the next 5 years, what kind of woman will emerge from that atmosphere? The answer was sobering. Not a stronger woman. Not a freer woman. Not a more grounded woman. A more guarded one. A more hesitant one. A woman who performs competence while quietly expecting herself to fail. A woman who never quite rests because she believes her value depends on staying one step ahead of her own humanity. I did not want to become her. So I had to stop confusing harshness with standards. That distinction changed everything for me. Because I do believe in standards. I believe in honesty, responsibility, accountability, depth, maturity, and follow-through. But standards and hostility are not the same thing. Hostility makes me afraid to look at myself clearly. Standards make me willing to. Hostility shames me into performance. Standards call me into alignment. Hostility says, look at you, failing again. Standards say, tell the truth, this is not the life you want to keep building. One humiliates. The other leads. I had spent too many years using humiliation as fuel. That works for a while. Fear can make a woman productive. Shame can make her polished. Anxiety can make her early, prepared, and astonishingly competent. But none of those things can make her feel at home in herself. And eventually, the cost becomes unbearable. She may still look high-functioning from the outside, but inside she is brittle. One disappointment away from collapse, one hard season away from emotional exhaustion, because she has built her life on internal pressure instead of internal safety. I did not want my mind to keep being a place where I only felt acceptable when I was doing well. So I started practicing a different kind of inner relationship. When I noticed myself spiraling, I stopped asking, what is wrong with me now? I asked, what is being activated in me right now? That question softened something important. It brought me out of accusation and into awareness. Instead of immediately becoming the prosecutor in my own trial, I could become the witness. I could notice what had happened, what I was feeling, what story had been triggered, what old fear had risen, what need had gone unattended. That made my mind less dramatic, but more truthful. I also had to become more careful about the conditions under which my thoughts were forming. I noticed that my mind was at its most unkind when I was overstimulated, underslept, hungry, rushed, or flooded with other people's voices. Certain habits were not just bad for my schedule. They were bad for the tone of my inner life. Checking my phone too early made my thoughts feel less like my own. Constant noise made me mentally shallow. Too much commentary from the outside made it harder for me to hear the quieter, more accurate voice inside me. That is why silence became so important. Not performative silence. Not the kind I post about. Real silence. Small pockets of it. Morning silence before the world began speaking at me. Driving without filling every moment. Sitting in a room without immediately reaching for a screen. Taking a walk without turning it into content, input, or efficiency. Silence is uncomfortable when I am used to outrunning myself, but eventually it becomes clarifying. It lets my thoughts separate from the static. It lets me hear what is mine and what is merely noise. I also started noticing that my mind contained different voices, and not all of them deserved equal authority. There was a part of me that panicked. A part that pleased. A part that criticized. A part that avoided. A part that wanted to disappear for a while. A part that wanted beauty. A part that was wiser than all the others but spoke the most quietly. Before, these voices had all blended together into one continuous stream. I assumed every thought that appeared in my mind carried equal truth. But that is not wisdom. That is chaos. Discernment began when I learned to ask, who is speaking right now? Is this the frightened part of me talking? The exhausted part? The part trained by old shame? The part that confuses familiarity with truth? Or is this something steadier? That question created space between me and my thoughts. And space is mercy. Because once I could separate from the loudest voice in the room, I could choose more consciously what to build around. I could stop obeying every impulse to catastrophize. I could stop treating my first reaction as my deepest truth. I could let thoughts pass without turning each one into prophecy. That changed the emotional climate of my days. I was no longer living in constant reaction to myself. And maybe that is what safety in the mind really is. Not the absence of hard thoughts, but the absence of instant betrayal. The knowledge that when grief rises, I will not punish myself for it. When I make a mistake, I will not turn it into an identity. When fear appears, I will listen without handing it full control of the house. When I fall out of rhythm, I will return without making the detour a definition of who I am. That kind of inner steadiness is not glamorous, but it is life-changing. Because a woman becomes different when her mind is no longer a place of constant ambush. She speaks differently, chooses differently, rests differently. She is less reactive, less desperate for external reassurance, less likely to outsource her worth to attention, productivity, or being needed. She becomes slower in the best way, more discerning, more difficult to manipulate, because she is no longer at war with herself and therefore does not need other people to settle arguments they did not create. That is what I wanted. Not a perfect mind. Not a permanently peaceful mind. A mind I could live in without flinching. A mind where honesty did not automatically become cruelty. A mind where standards did not require fear. A mind where my own humanity was not treated like an inconvenience. A mind that could hold sorrow, uncertainty, growth, beauty, regret, tenderness, and change without turning every one of them into evidence against me. I did not need my mind to become impressive. I needed it to become habitable. And once it began to, even in small ways, I understood something I had not fully known before. I was not just trying to change my life. I was trying to build an inner world that no longer made me want to escape it. I let go of what was draining me, even when it was familiar. One of the hardest truths I had to accept was that not everything draining me was dramatic enough to make leaving feel obvious. If something is clearly cruel, clearly broken, clearly destructive, the mind can at least build a case. There is language for it. There is sympathy for it. There is a story I can tell myself about why it has to end. But what exhausted me most was often far less theatrical than that. It was familiar. It was woven into the texture of my days. It looked like habits, dynamics, conversations, obligations, emotional roles, and patterns of access that had become so normal, I almost mistook them for love, loyalty, maturity, or simply the cost of being the kind of woman I had always been. That is what made letting go so difficult. I was not only releasing what hurt me. I was releasing what had become recognizable to me. And familiarity has a strange power. It can make depletion feel reasonable. It can make overextension feel virtuous. It can make emotional hunger feel adult. It can make a woman stay in rooms, relationships, rhythms, and identities long after she has stopped thriving there, simply because she knows how to function inside them. I knew how to function inside a lot of things that were quietly draining me. I knew how to be the one who responded quickly, the one who kept the temperature down, the one who reached out first, the one who remembered what everyone else forgot, the one who tolerated more than she wanted to admit. The one who translated, softened, excused, anticipated, and carried. The one who could absorb the discomfort in a room and keep things moving. For years, I told myself these were signs of my strength. And maybe in some ways they were. But strength can become distortion when it is overused in the wrong direction. There is a version of capability that turns a woman into infrastructure. People lean on her, rely on her, expect her, praise her for being so good at handling things, and eventually stop noticing the cost of her constancy because she has become part of the architecture. Useful. Stable. Expected. Less like a person, more like a system. That realization hurt me more than I expected. Because once I saw it, I could not unsee how many parts of my life depended on my willingness to remain endlessly reachable. Not loved in a deep, reciprocal way. Reachable. Available. Flexible. Interpretable. Forgiving. Easy to access and hard to truly nourish. I had to let that version of me begin to die. Not because she was weak. Not because she was foolish. But because she was living too far away from her own center. Letting go started there, in ways so small they almost seemed invisible. I did not answer everything immediately. I did not offer explanations where a simple no would do. I did not keep extending conversations that had already turned draining. I stopped volunteering emotional labor to people who had grown comfortable receiving it without noticing what it cost me. I stopped translating my boundaries into language so soft that everyone else could stay perfectly comfortable while I disappeared behind the effort of being understood. These may sound like small things, but they change a life. Because there comes a moment when a woman has to decide whether she wants to keep being well-liked in old patterns, or deeply loyal to the life she is trying to build. Often, she cannot have both. That is the part no one romanticizes. Growth is often not rewarded right away. Sometimes it makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes it makes me look different in a way others do not know how to interpret. Sometimes the same people who admired my kindness become unsettled by my limits. Sometimes what they called warmth was actually access, and when the access changes, so does their perception of me. I had to make peace with that. I also had to let go of relationships that did not collapse in one obvious moment, but wore me down by repetition. Relationships where I was too often the listener, the stabilizer, the reasonable one, the one who gave more language, more patience, more benefit of the doubt than I was receiving. Relationships where the conversation always returned to the same emotional weather, the same resentments, the same chaos, the same appetite for drama disguised as intimacy. Relationships that survived on my empathy, but did not strengthen me in return. This was not about becoming cold. It was about becoming honest. There are people I loved who were still draining me. There were dynamics I understood that were still diminishing me. There were histories I respected that were still asking me to stay in versions of myself I no longer wanted to occupy. That is one of the deeper griefs of reinvention, realizing that not everything familiar is meant to accompany me into the next chapter. Some people only knew how to meet the older version of me, the more agreeable one, the more over-available one, the one with lower standards for reciprocity, the one who still made room for confusion out of guilt, nostalgia, or hope. And I do not say that with bitterness. I say it with sadness. Because some letting go is not angry. Some of it is tender. Some of it is simply the quiet recognition that a bond no longer matches the woman I am becoming, even if it once mattered deeply. Some of it is accepting that history and alignment are not the same thing. A long relationship is not automatically a life-giving one. Shared years do not always equal shared direction. I had to grieve that without turning it into blame. I also had to let go of older versions of myself that still lived inside me like unfinished stories. The woman who thought being chosen would heal her. The woman who over-explained because she was afraid truth by itself would not be enough. The woman who stayed soft long after softness stopped being sacred and became self-erasure. The woman who could sense misalignment early but kept negotiating with it because she did not want to seem difficult. The woman who kept trying to earn clear love from unclear people. I had compassion for her. I really did. But compassion is not the same as permission to keep living from the same wound. So I started practicing goodbyes. Not always out loud. Not always in ways anyone else could see. Some goodbyes happened in a journal. Some happened while clearing out a drawer. Some happened when I stopped rereading old messages. Some happened while deleting photographs I had kept as proof that something once mattered. Some happened when I stopped revisiting old pain in the name of understanding it better. Some happened in silence, without announcement, when I simply refused to keep reopening a door that had already shown me what lived behind it. I think women are often taught that closure is something we receive. But much of the closure that changed my life was something I gave myself. I wrote goodbye letters I never sent. To relationships that taught me more than they held me. To identities I had outgrown but still felt loyal to. To the version of me who believed being needed was the same thing as being cherished. To whole chapters of my life that were not evil, not wasted, not meaningless, but no longer alive. There was something dignifying about that. It let me leave without pretending I had never cared. It let me honor what was true without forcing it to remain current. And still, even with all of that clarity, letting go was lonely sometimes. Not because I had made the wrong decision, but because peace can feel strangely empty when I have spent years associating aliveness with intensity. When the phone gets quieter, when the drama thins out, when I stop overcommitting, when I stop making myself endlessly available, there can be a strange silence that follows. At first, that silence can feel like loss. It can feel like no one needs me. No one is reaching. No one is pulling. No one is asking. But I had to learn the difference between loneliness and spaciousness. Loneliness says I have been abandoned. Spaciousness says I have room again. That difference changed everything for me. Because once I stopped misreading peace as emptiness, I could start receiving it differently. A quiet evening no longer meant I was unwanted. It meant my life was no longer being constantly interrupted. A weekend with fewer plans no longer meant I was missing out. It meant I was finally present enough to notice what actually restores me. A smaller circle no longer felt like failure. It felt like a more truthful map of where intimacy could really breathe. I even had to create new rituals to help my body understand that this quieter life was not a punishment. New ways of spending holidays. New kinds of weekends. New small pleasures. A walk, a bookstore, flowers, a better meal, a slower morning, a table for one, a room that felt cared for. These things were not just aesthetic choices. They were emotional retraining. They taught me that life could still feel full without feeling crowded. That is what letting go gave me in the end, not emptiness, but coherence. Less fragmentation. Less performance. Less internal leaking. More room to feel what is mine. More room to hear what is true. More room to build a life that does not depend on my constant self-betrayal to keep running. And that, I think, is the quiet miracle of release. It rarely looks triumphant when it begins. It often looks like fewer invitations, fewer explanations, fewer tolerances, fewer emotional entanglements, fewer old reflexes. It can look like less. But sometimes less is the first honest shape of a life that is finally becoming whole. I built new habits that matched the woman I said I wanted to be. There is a moment in every reinvention when the vision stops being enough. I can know exactly what kind of woman I want to become. I can describe her standards, her pace, her energy, her home, the way she dresses, the way she protects her peace, the way she no longer abandons herself. I can feel her clearly in my mind. I can even ache for her. But eventually, desire has to become behavior. Otherwise, the future self remains a beautiful emotional concept that never enters the body of my real life. That was the turning point for me. I realized I did not need more promises. I needed proof. Not dramatic proof. Not the kind that can be posted, announced, admired, or measured by anyone else. I needed the kind of proof that quietly changes the relationship I have with myself. The kind that teaches me, over time, that my life is no longer built on what I say I want, but on what I repeatedly choose. That is what habits became for me. Not punishment. Not optimization for the sake of image. Not another rigid structure to fail inside. Habits became how I stopped being a stranger to my own intentions. Because one of the quietest forms of self-betrayal is saying the same beautiful things to myself over and over, while continuing to build days that contradict them. I say I want peace, but I keep living in reaction. I say I want health, but I keep feeding myself like an afterthought. I say I want depth, but I keep spending my most alive hours in distraction. I say I want a different life, but my mornings, evenings, spending, rhythms, and decisions keep voting for the old one. That mismatch wears on a woman. It does not always break her loudly, but it creates an inner disappointment that collects over time. The disappointment of hearing my own words and not trusting them. The disappointment of setting intentions that never become a life. The disappointment of wanting change while continuing to rehearse the same day in different outfits. I was tired of that disappointment. So I stopped thinking of habits as chores I had to force myself through, and I started thinking of them as emotional architecture. The invisible structure holding up the kind of life I said I wanted to live. A habit is not just what I do. It is what I normalize. It is what I rehearse. It is what I let become familiar. And whatever becomes familiar eventually starts to feel like who I am. That is why I had to become more careful about the way I spoke to myself around change. I stopped framing everything as something I had to do. That language always made my life feel like a sentence I was serving. I did not want to live that way anymore. I wanted my choices to come from identity, not resentment. So I began asking different questions. Not, what should I force myself to do? But, what would the woman I am becoming consider normal? Would she wake up and immediately hand her mind to the world? Would she leave her days unshaped and then call the chaos stress? Would she keep making decisions from depletion and then wonder why she felt disconnected? Would she stay in habits that made her feel vaguely ashamed of her own life? No. She would create rhythms that make her feel trustworthy to herself. That became my focus. Trustworthiness. I wanted to become the kind of woman who did not need a dramatic mood, a crisis, or a new month to return to herself. I wanted steadier evidence than that. So I started smaller than my old perfectionism wanted me to. I stopped trying to build a whole new life in one burst of motivation and started shaping the ordinary edges of my day. I began with the morning, because mornings tell the truth about a life. Not in some rigid, moral way, but in an intimate way. How I wake up, what I touch first, what I expose my mind to, whether I begin in presence or reaction, these things carry into everything else. I stopped making the first minutes of my day available to noise. I let light in. I made the bed. I drank water before reaching for anything that would speed me up artificially. I tried to create a first hour that did not immediately scatter me. Some mornings were quiet and graceful. Some were ordinary and imperfect. That was not the point. The point was that I was no longer beginning my day as if I had already lost it. That changed something subtle but powerful in me. It made me feel less chased by my own life. Then there were the habits that seem too small to matter until they are repeated long enough to change a woman's relationship with herself. Putting things back where they belong. Planning before panic. Looking at the week before it begins. Choosing food before I get desperate. Laying out clothes the night before a full day. Cleaning the kitchen before bed, not for appearances, but because I wanted the morning version of me to walk into order instead of leftovers. None of this is glamorous. That is exactly why it matters. Glamour can distract. Habits reveal. I also had to build habits around visibility. That may sound strange, but I think many women in this season of life have become so practiced at shrinking in socially acceptable ways that being visible again can feel almost unnatural. Not visible in the sense of performance. Visible in the sense of occupying space without apology. Speaking clearly. Going places alone. Making eye contact. Asking questions. Wearing the thing that reflects me instead of the thing that hides me. Letting myself be seen in my own life. That required what I think of as gentle exposure. I started doing more things alone, not to prove independence in some hard, brittle way, but to rebuild intimacy with myself. A coffee alone. A bookstore alone. A walk with no destination except presence. Sitting in a restaurant without acting as if I had been abandoned there. These small acts changed me more than I expected. They taught me that solitude did not have to mean lack. It could mean self-contact. It could mean I was no longer outsourcing all atmosphere, all ease, all permission to experience life to other people's availability. That confidence cannot be faked for long. It has to be practiced until the body believes it. I also built habits that protected my attention, because attention is one of the most revealing forms of self-respect. Where I place it, what I let interrupt it, how quickly I surrender it, how carelessly I scatter it. These things shape not only my productivity, but my sense of self. I stopped answering everything immediately. I stopped believing urgency deserved automatic access to me. I gave more things a pause before a response. I let some messages wait. I let silence do more work. I let people experience me as less instantly available, because I was trying to experience myself as more internally present. Boundaries became habits too. And that was important, because a boundary that exists only as a belief is still fragile. It becomes real when it enters my calendar, my phone, my energy, my mouth, my decisions. Not attending everything is a habit. Not explaining every choice is a habit. Not opening emotional doors out of guilt is a habit. Leaving when I am done is a habit. Choosing what aligns over what is expected is a habit. These habits did not make me colder. They made me more coherent. I also began creating deliberate rituals that helped my life feel led rather than merely managed. Once a week, I gave myself what I think of as an hour of dignity. An hour to improve something tangible in my life. Review my spending. Refill what I need before I run out. Clear the bag, the drawer, the inbox, the counter, the mental clutter. Make the appointment. Steam the clothes. Order the vitamins. Handle the thing I keep delaying. These were not productivity stunts. They were a way of refusing to let small avoidances pile up into an atmosphere of quiet self-neglect. Once a month, I sat down with myself more seriously. Tea, notebook, honesty. I looked at what was working, what was draining me, what I kept saying I wanted, what I kept postponing, what needed to be changed. I thought of it as a private meeting with my own life. Not severe. Not performative. Just clear. So many women spend years running homes, families, work, emotional climates, and logistics for everyone around them, while almost never sitting down to lead their own inner and outer life with that same steadiness. I no longer wanted to live in that kind of neglect. And then there was this deeper habit, maybe the deepest one of all, returning. Returning after a bad day. Returning after a week that went sideways. Returning after old patterns showed up again. Returning without turning the detour into a character judgment. This matters more than any perfect routine. Because the life I wanted could not be built by intensity alone. It had to be built by return. Return to the meal. Return to the walk. Return to the morning. Return to the standard. Return to the truth. Return to myself without making every lapse a full emotional collapse. That is what made the habits sustainable. Not perfection, but relationship. I was no longer using habits to prove I was worthy. I was using them to create a life that felt worthy of being lived awake. And over time, something changed that was hard to describe but impossible to miss. I started believing myself. Not because I had become flawless, but because my days were beginning to match my language. The woman I had written about, longed for, imagined, and felt inside myself was no longer just appearing in moments of inspiration. She was showing up in repeated choices. In the sink being cleared. In the phone being put away. In the walk being taken. In the no being said. In the plans being made. In the lonely evening not being numbed over. In the quiet life being tended to instead of escaped. That is how a woman becomes real to herself again. Not all at once. Not in one breakthrough. Not in some dazzling before and after reveal. But in the slow accumulation of habits that finally say, with no performance and no drama, this is who I live like now. My new life did not begin when everything was perfect, It began when I became available for it. I used to think a new life would arrive like a reward. A reward for finally getting everything right. For becoming more disciplined. More healed. More organized. More certain. More beautiful. More rested. More emotionally mature. More financially stable. More clear about what I wanted. I thought there would be some invisible threshold, and once I crossed it, life would open. Things would click. I would feel different. I would become the woman I had been trying to reach for years. But that is not how it happened. My new life did not begin when everything became perfect. It began much earlier than that, and much quieter too. It began the moment I stopped waiting for certainty to make me worthy of change. It began when I became available for a different way of living, even before I felt fully ready to hold it. That distinction matters. Because I think many women spend years standing at the edge of their own lives, believing they are preparing when they are actually postponing. We tell ourselves we will start once we have more energy, more time, more confidence, more money, more clarity, fewer responsibilities, less fear, less grief, less mess. We imagine that transformation requires ideal conditions. We imagine that beginning again is something clean and elegant, something that happens after we have finally tied up the loose ends of who we used to be. But real life does not move that way. Real life asks something more intimate and more difficult. It asks whether I am willing to meet a better life before I have mastered it. Whether I am willing to act from truth before I feel fully transformed by it. Whether I am willing to stop treating my future like a distant concept and start receiving it in the form it actually arrives. Small, ordinary, sometimes inconvenient opportunities to choose differently. That is how it began for me. Not with one grand turning point, but with a series of moments that could have looked insignificant to anyone else. A slower answer. A more honest no. A room made gentler. A phone call not returned immediately. A morning handled with more intention. A night ended with more care. A conversation I no longer extended out of politeness. A purchase I did not make. A truth I did not talk myself out of. A silence I did not rush to fill. A need I finally treated as real. At the time, these did not feel like the beginning of a new life. They felt almost too small to count. But that is the thing I understand now. A new life rarely enters dramatically. It enters through availability. Through what I am finally willing to allow, to stop allowing, to notice, to honor, to protect, to believe, to release. And availability is not the same thing as readiness. Readiness wants guarantees. Availability makes room. Readiness says, once I am different, then I will begin. Availability says, I will begin, and becoming different will happen inside that beginning. I wish more women were told that. I wish more women were told that they do not have to become flawless before they become honest. That they do not have to finish healing before they begin living in a way that supports healing. That they do not have to erase every contradiction before taking one faithful step toward a life that fits better. That they are allowed to want more from their lives without first proving how deeply they have suffered. Because one of the saddest ways to lose years is by waiting to deserve what is already asking for me. And I think so many of us do exactly that. We wait to be chosen by our own courage. We wait to feel less afraid. We wait to be less complicated. We wait to be less tired. We wait for a cleaner season. We wait for a version of ourselves that will make the change feel effortless. But effortlessly is not what changes a life. Availability does. Availability says I am no longer completely closed. I am no longer arguing with what I know. I am no longer committed to the performance of being fine. I am no longer pretending that what drains me is neutral. I am no longer delaying every real thing until a later version of me comes to rescue this one. That was the deeper shift for me. I stopped waiting to be rescued by some future self and started becoming someone I could actually join in the present. That changed my relationship not just to change, but to myself. I stopped speaking to myself as if my real life would begin later. I stopped treating my desires like embarrassments I had to minimize. I stopped assuming that because I had adapted to a life, I was obligated to remain inside it forever. I stopped thinking that longing itself was a sign of ingratitude. Longing is not always greed. Sometimes longing is wisdom. Sometimes it is the deepest part of me recognizing that I have been living below my own truth for too long. And once I understood that, I could stop relating to my desires as if they were dangerous. I could start listening to them more carefully. Not every desire deserves obedience, of course. But some desires are not random at all. They are signals. They point toward the shape of a life that would allow me to feel more awake, more coherent, more present, more inhabited. That is what my new life gave me, more than anything else. Not perfection. Not constant happiness. Not some polished version of womanhood untouched by grief, inconvenience, aging, disappointment, or uncertainty. It gave me inhabitation. I use that word very intentionally, because before, I was living a life I could manage. Now I am learning to live a life I can actually inhabit. A life I can feel from the inside. A life where I am not just performing stability, but increasingly experiencing it. A life where my days are not always easy, but they are more honest, more aligned, more reflective of what I value, more respectful of what I need, more faithful to what I know. That matters more to me now than any before and after image ever could. What changed first was not my whole life. What changed first was my relationship to it. I stopped moving through my days like I was permanently behind. I stopped assuming exhaustion was the price of being a good woman. I stopped handing my attention to whatever was loudest. I stopped making myself available to every demand and unavailable to my own inner life. I stopped acting as if beauty, peace, depth, rest, and self-respect were luxuries I would eventually earn after finishing all my responsibilities. No. These things did not remove me from my life. They returned me to it. And yes, I want to be honest here too, there is still no perfect version of this story. There are still hard days. There are still old reflexes that try to return. There are still moments when I feel stretched, uncertain, discouraged, or pulled toward familiar patterns. There are still seasons that ask more from me than I wish they did. Reinvention did not erase my humanity. It did not make me untouchable. It did not turn me into some serene creature floating above ordinary life. What it did was make me less willing to abandon myself inside ordinary life. That is the real difference. I recover faster. I tell the truth sooner. I notice misalignment earlier. I choose with more care. I return with less drama. I protect what matters with more maturity. I no longer need every part of life to be perfect in order to know when something is finally more true. That is what becoming available did for me. It made truth easier to recognize and harder to betray. And maybe that is all a new life really is in the beginning. Not an entirely different existence. Not a miracle. Not a fantasy. Just a woman who slowly stops refusing herself. A woman who stops postponing her own presence. A woman who becomes willing to participate in her life with more honesty than performance. A woman who no longer waits for ideal conditions to begin honoring what she knows. I think that is especially powerful for women in this middle season of life, because we know enough by now to understand that time is not abstract. We know how quickly years can become habits, how easily habits can become identity, and how silently identity can become destiny if it is never questioned. We know what it costs to keep telling ourselves maybe next year, maybe after this season, maybe when things calm down. But life does not always calm down. Sometimes I have to become calm enough inside it to choose differently anyway. That is what I mean when I say my new life began when I became available for it. It began when I stopped demanding perfection from the beginning. It began when I let ordinary choices carry sacred weight. It began when I accepted that change does not need to arrive loudly to be real. It began when I decided that even without certainty, even without applause, even without a flawless plan, I was no longer willing to keep living at a distance from myself. And maybe that is where all real change begins. Not in mastery. Not in image. Not in becoming someone else. But in the quiet, radical decision to stop closing the door on the life that has been trying to reach me for years. You're not broken. You're just in the middle,